Good evening and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, moles and mole rats, and various other underground badgers and things like that. Welcome to, as Tony said, thank you very much for the introduction, Tony, the second in the Brit lockdown webinars, the Into the Dark. Now, what we're doing today is we're going to talk, or this evening, we're going to talk about underground Stockport, and we're going to talk about the air raid shelters that are in the Stockport sandstone. First and foremost, why me? I did 14 years, less for murder, with Stockport Museum Service, and for a large part of that, I was actually in charge of the visitor attraction Stockport Air Raid Shelters Experience. As part of that, I was recruited, a bit like a communist spy, into Subterranea Britannica, and from that grew an opportunity to share my knowledge of underground spaces and to share my photography of underground spaces under the Tunnelinspector branding. I was lucky enough to get funding from the local council and from Brit to do a city and guilds in high-risk confined spaces, which means that I can do risk assessments, safety assessments, and I can safely enter these underground spaces and try to make sure we don't lose too many visitors on Brit trips. The photograph there, the fantastic photograph, is by Ed Waters, and it's on our Nottingham trip in a unused catacomb. As well as the Subterranea Britannica and Tunnelinspector and local council stuff, I've worked with Manchester Histories, I've worked with the Manchester International Festival, and last year I was lucky enough to be a senior guide on the Drunk Pandemic event when a group of quite mad Japanese artists brought a brewery, a pop-up brewery, in a plague pit deep in a tunnel underneath Victoria Station in Manchester, and then we charged people to go around and contribute urine to a piss bricks project. This is all genuine art, and that was good fun. So keep an eye out on a future Sub-T magazine for the report on that. Now I'm allowed to share it. So that's why I'm here. Why Stockport? Now, I'm sure you all recognise the gentleman in the middle, famous for scrawling matchstick men and matchstick cats and dogs on bits of napkins instead of paying for pints. He's obviously L.S. Lowry. He painted Stockport, he painted Salford, he painted Greater Manchester in general, and the map to one side, which we'll look again at in a bit, shows you the location of Stockport. So Stockport's about 6 miles south of Manchester. It's built up right the way through. There's no fields and cows and things in between. And one of the things that links the two together is in the middle photograph, the absolutely fantastic Stockport Viaduct. It's 4 sets of rails. It takes trains across the Mersey River, and it's one of the main links between Manchester and London. So, of course, during World War II, whenever the goods and items were coming from Canada and the US, they were coming over to Western Approaches in Liverpool and then coming up the ship canal. They were getting offloaded in Manchester, loaded onto trains, and they would cross this viaduct heading south. So it's the main route south for all war goods coming in from the US and from neutral countries. Okay, the last photo you can see there is the shelters being dug with a distinct lack of health and safety, and we'll look at that in a minute. But first and foremost, what have we got in Stockport for undergroundy stuff? So this is an example of the Tunnelinspector map that's available. You can click on it. You can click on each of these blue dots, and they'll tell you a bit and show you some pictures of an underground space or an interesting space in the area. It doesn't just do Stockport, but you can see how heavily the dots fit in the centre there, and just here. And then, as you can see, what you have is the rivers of Stockport. This is the Tame, and this is the Goyt, and they meet just here underneath Sainsbury's, and they make their way out that way to become the Mersey. So this section here is actually Mersey Way, and that is a shopping centre that's built on a bridge over the river. So it's the widest bridge in the world, as far as we know, just under a mile wide, technically. They're quite proud of that, and we're going to look at a couple of pictures of that in a minute. So what else is under there in the sandstone of Stockport? We have, as you can see, crypts, cave dwellings, dungeons, water tunnels, pub cellars, vaults, industry, of all types, public toilets, they like putting those underground, ice houses, or an ice house, the Mersey, like I said, itself, and mines and mining as well. Stockport actually had quite a lot of coal mining. They're all closed off now and long gone, but you see the odd bit remaining, the odd building, and every so often a bit of field will disappear into a hole in the ground. So we have next bit of paper. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run through this group and oh, can't see the pointer. Let me try that again. I know I'm running 10 seconds behind, but basically the two blue lines going from Tesco's and the Midway pub, and they come down. There's a sort of channel of blue dots with a gap in between, and that's where the Mersey bridge is. What I'll do is I'll skip the pointer if you can't see it. Okay. So looking at crypts, you can see this is there's a variety of wonderful crypts. Most of them we don't advertise because they've built houses on top of them, and people get a bit worried about that. They're a bit worried if they've all seen Poltergeist, and they're a bit worried that there's someone's going to pop up in their cellar. But this is an interesting crypt. This is a photograph I took for a photo shoot I did for the 200th anniversary of the main church in Stockport, St Mary's in the Marketplace. And this is the tomb of W. Robert Crowther, a silk throster and manufacturer from Heaton Norris. He was buried in 1796. Hopefully he died around the same time. And as time went on, his rather beautiful, very large 9 foot by 4 foot stone in the floor of the church was shifted about, moved around, and finally the Victorians built a nice floor on top of it, and there's only about 12 inches clearance. So that picture of me on the left hand side there, that's I'm literally lying on the floor and my shoulder is touching the beams of the floor above, and you can see what a pain it was to light. But I was lucky enough to get that photo used in the exhibition. We blew it up quite large, and we were able to put that up and use it as part of the 200th anniversary of part of the church. The rest of the church goes 1,000 years old, but that bit was 200 years old. So we got various crypts and things. Cave dwellings. If any of you were at the Reading conference, I spoke on this there. This is Dowel Cave in Derbyshire, and it's a Stone Age burial site, and we're lucky enough to have the two of the burials. That's Fred and Ginger there on the right hand side, and they're in Stockport Museum. You could go and see them when it reopens to the public after the pandemic is over. And they've been there for just over 5,000 years, so we don't think they mind too much about being moved to a nice warm dry museum. And so what we have is cave systems that have been used, like Cresswell Crags, like Dowel Cave. They've been used repeatedly for hundreds of years. All right, so, and the second one here is called Maggie's Caves, and this is in Brinksway. And this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because it's still in use. It's actually a homeless spot. It's a spot where quite a lot of the homeless people in Stockport tend to live, and you can see the soot marks here on the sandstone from their campfires and the variety of things that they use. This, just the other side of these archways, is actually a 40-foot drop down into the river Mersey, and fairly regularly somebody falls out of it. The fire service have to go and save them. They all get closed up again, and within a week they've moved back in. Interestingly, there's continuous occupation on these caves since about 1500. So one of the things that as an archaeologist I would be very interested in is taking off that top layer of duvets and needles and stolen CDs and things, and actually digging down through the flooring there to see what's below it. It's been reused and reused. It was used as an air raid shelter during the war, and it's been reused as drainage. And just the other side of the road from these, and is the the Brinksway Shelters, which we'll be looking at later. So these being in location means that it's probably one of the things that spurred William Gardner to think about building the air raid shelters in these locations, because he could see if these caves had been here for 450 years at that point, they're not going to fall down. They're quite deep. They're quite easy to get into, and they are quite secure. All right. So next one. The dungeon. Quite popular. It's open to the public. You can go, and Stockport Heritage Trust look after the dungeon, and it's a very popular visit. It is slightly larger than that. There's 3 cells. They're all quite deep under the sandstone lump that Stockport is built on, as you can see by the steps. And they were originally part of the market office, and they were used to lock up people who had had too much to drink, people who were making too much noise, people who were at the market causing problems. And they were really sort of for 24 hours, sober up, go home. And they weren't a jail in the sense that you would think of a jail, but they were quite useful for locking up people until they could be taken to a prison in either Manchester at the New Bailey or to Chester, and then they would be looked at the Assizes. So you had to be quite careful when you committed a fairly serious crime, because if you committed it just after a set of Assizes, it was another 3.5 months, and you would sit in Chester Jail, which is Chester Castle, waiting for the judge to travel around and come and see you. So you can visit this. It's well worth a visit. Ones that you can't officially visit are these water tunnels, and these are a set of overlapping or leapfrogging tunnels from where there used to be large mills. And of course, the mills were run by water power. And one of the reasons that Stockport is where it is, you've got these 2 big rivers, the Tame and the Goyt, coming in, and it's lots of fresh, clean water, lots of power. And what these are is a set of tunnels built in the 1780s by Marsland and Stringer, who were 2 competing mill owners. And what happened was Marsland dug a tunnel diverting the flow of the river to his mill to run his water wheels, and made lots of money. And then Stringer went further upriver, dug a longer tunnel, stole his water, which meant that Marsland then leapfrogged up again. So what we've got is, I think it's about 4 tunnels. One of them's nearly a mile long. They're very much filled in, and if you know the actual location, you can drop into them. They're in a public park, but there is a distinct whiff of hydrogen sulfide when you land, so it's not advised. It's definitely not a sub-Brit trip. They're also very muddy and full of spiders. More interesting to, I think, quite a few of us here, in the same sandstone lump that we had with the dungeons and that the air raid shelters are dug into, what we find is the pub cellars on the marketplace, and they're quite big. They're double height. The one with the stairs on the left there, that was actually found when the floor collapsed and the whole of the vaults underneath were flooded. And what it was, that's the Baker's Vaults in the town centre. The one next to it is the Angel Inn. And then over to one side, at the very bottom, the small there, you've got the Boar's Head. Now, these are all pubs that are in quite close proximity. And they've got these double height cellars, and they've got a lot of underground space that's been used over the years for storage. It's been used for vaults. It's been used for nightclubs. The Sinking Ship nightclub was in one of these. Jimi Hendrix played there, and The Who. And there's all this sort of this extra usage going on below ground in the town centre, while the rest of things are going on up above. This is a nice little one. This is part of a vault called Turner's Vaults, and Mr. Turner he definitely wasn't a champagne manufacturer, because you can only make champagne if you do that in the Champagne region of France, but he may have made Stockport sparkling wine that tasted like champagne in about 1880, 1890, and he did it in these vaults. Now, I was lucky enough to blag the opportunity to go in from the current owners, which is a brewery. And they said, as long as I put a new padlock on, they were happy for me to wander around under there, have a look, make sure nothing was going to fall on top of the air raid shelters, which are actually below this. You know, lead me to it. They, as far as they were concerned, they were empty. And they really weren't empty. There was an entire garage in there with 2 cars, a Stag, a Triumph Stag, and a Citroen from the 80s. There were thousands of these bottles, all branded for Turner. And that machine on the right-hand side at the bottom is actually, you would sit on there, you would put the bottle of fizzy wine at the end, and you would force the cork in using all your power so it didn't fire back at you, and put the wire cage on the top for this sparkling wine that definitely wasn't champagne. At the same location, just to one side, so that vault that you just looked at is behind the car and the garage door on the right hand side there, and you have these 2 funny holes in the wall. You go in and you look up and you see this chimney leading up, and these are actually tin smelting sites in central Stockport, and they're literally right in the centre of town, and they date for around 1200, and they were the location of quite a thriving industry when they were smelting down tin and sending the noxious fumes up through those rock cut, sandstone cut, hand carved chimneys up above. The photo on the left is underneath our small market hall. We've got a big Victorian one and a small one. This is under the small one, and it's actually an air raid shelter. It was certified to hold about 20 people, I think. I'll have a look. I've got the notes in a moment. And that was actually one of the air raid shelters that was an alternative to the ones we're going to look at today. As always, you've got your underground toilets. They turn up everywhere, and the Victorians love their underground toilets. And there's some nice examples. The ones to the right are the old girls' grammar school, or the girls' school in Greek Street in Stockport, and they've been abandoned since the 60s and just used for rubbish dumping. The one to the left is quite interesting, as that's now the entrance. It's the old men's toilets in the town centre, the shopping centre, from the 60s, and they were open up until about the 1980s. And that door that you can see on the far wall with the wiring going through it was the original entrance to the riverbank. We're going to look at the riverbank in a minute because, as I said, the whole of the shopping centre is built on a massive bridge that covers the riverbank for about a mile, and that was the original way in. So if you used to go to use the toilets down there, you could hear the river rushing by on the other side of that door. Nowadays, they don't use the underground toilets, and it's now the official entrance if you're going underneath the river or underneath the shopping centre, which we were lucky enough to do as part of a visit. And I actually spoke on that at Brit conference 3 years ago, I think. 2017. That will be written up again for Sub-T at some point in the future. Bit more traditional undergroundy stuff. We have a very nice ice house. It's in the grounds of the old rectory, which was in the town centre. It's now a hotel. It's now Green King Hungry Horse Hotel, and you could just go and park your car, and it's there in the gardens of the hotel. There's no gates on it or anything. You can go and visit, and it's got some very nice brickwork. It was all cleaned up by the Heritage Trust a few years ago, and they quite regularly go in and see whether there's anything been dumped in it, as you can see, but it's in immaculate condition. Now, as I was telling you about the Mersey Way, this is actually what's underneath the river, over the river and underneath the shopping centre. So as you can see, it's actually a mile-long concrete-covered, concrete-supported bridge that was done in 1938, and it was done at the same time as the air raid shelters were being built, but in a very futuristic style. And it's still holding up the shopping centre to this day. And you can go down and visit, and to get onto that walkway, you go down through the old gents' loos and through that door that I showed you. And there's actually a gantry that you can see there that comes backwards and forwards. There's bats in there, so you can only visit at very specific times. They used to open for Heritage Open Days, but unfortunately the two gentlemen who were the only ones who were certified to do the tour both lost their jobs, so it meant that they weren't able to carry on doing that safely. One of the things that Brit has been in touch with the group is with the group Mersey Holdings that own the shopping centre, is to arrange visits down there for interested parties that we would then take on our insurance and everything to do that. All right. So not only do we have the mines and mining, the coal mining, but we also have some very nice mines over in Alderley Edge that are looked after by Derbyshire Caving Club, and they were going to be the visits last week for Brit that unfortunately all fell through due to the pandemic. And this is Engine Vein Mine. It's actually a Bronze Age copper mine that the Romans expanded, and then the Victorians expanded, and again closed in 1919, and it had a large adit, a very big adit going in open to the sky that was causing problems in the 60s. People and sheep and things kept falling into it, so it was covered over in a very clever concrete cap, and this door was put in. And like I said, Derbyshire Caving Club do regular tours down there for scouts and guides and interested parties, and it's quite an interesting one, because when you go into Engine Vein and you go down through the levels, you can see some of the height there. It actually goes down quite far, and then at the very bottom you go down to a level called the Hof Level, and that's a mile-long flooded tunnel. You get a little boat and you paddle your way through, and you can actually come up in a different mine called Wood Mine, which is a mile away. So you go down in one spot and come up in a different one, which you're not really supposed to do most of the time, but is acceptable as long as you're being looked after by the cavers. And there we go. So just checking my buzzer. It's just gone off, telling me it's time to move on and finally get to the point of the talk, which is air raid shelters. So this is a very nice picture, if I say so myself, and it's of what's actually Brinksway Air Raid Shelter, and it gives you a really good idea of what the shelters in Stockport are like, the 5 main shelters. And they are sandstone carved by hand, and they are 7 foot high by 7 foot wide. They have concrete lining if there's a fault in the sandstone above and at each of the entrances. And a lot of the entrances, they actually go down into the ground, and there's sets of steps. Now, thankfully within Stockport, remember we've got the river there and the sandstone coming up either side of it. One of the things that's actually quite useful is that you can dig into the side of the sandstone at the riverbank, and you can get really deep quite quickly and not expend too much energy. So they're very steep cliffs. So if you dig in at ground level, you can be 60 feet underground within a really quite reasonable distance. And that's what's happened at Brinksway and at Chestergate. So this is back to that map of Stockport without all the blue dots on it. And if you look at the blue lines, you've got the 2 blue lines coming in to make a Y shape, and they meet in the centre there near where the A is, and the River Mersey starts there. And it's the beginning of the Mersey, start of the Mersey, and it makes its way off. But basically that sandstone is a 65 million year old desert that's been laid down, and that piece of that sandstone runs through from Nottingham, it runs through Stockport and Manchester, and it runs off to Liverpool. So when you go to the caves of Nottingham, the shelters in Stockport, and Williamson's tunnels in Liverpool, it's all the same strata of sandstone that was laid down 65 million years ago when it was all a desert. And we know this because it's been tested. We also know this because at various points in the Stockport Chestergate shelters, you can actually see dinosaur bones sticking out of the wall, and you can see them on the extended tours and the spooky tours. You can actually visit that, and it's the only location I've ever seen where one of the highlights of your tour is you get to stick your finger in a dinosaur bone, which they frown at if you do it at the British Museum. So if you went to this location now, in the present day, instead of 1938, when this photograph was taken, it'll look very, very different. So in 1938, at the back of the co-op in Stockport, they decided that the road needed widening, and they cleared some slum housing from the side of the road. And what happened was they discovered all these holes. There are actually 3 levels of holes. And what had discovered had happened is the small houses there were paying quite low rates, and they were telling everybody that they were perilously poor. They had tiny houses, they couldn't extend the houses, they couldn't do anything, and they didn't have to pay lots of tax. And what they were doing was industriously digging large holes behind into the sandstone face of the cliff behind them and extending their houses. So what they found is some of these houses were actually 3 or 4 times the size that you thought they were, because they dug back into the cliffs and they'd linked up all these tunnels, and they'd utilized caves that were there before that may have been used for bear baiting a few hundred years ago, but had definitely been used as storage and cellarage from about 1650 onwards. We've got records of them from then. So if you stood at this location nowadays, you'd look at the rather lovely entrance to the Stockport Air Raid Shelters experience, but behind you would be Primark. One of the things that makes the shelters such a good museum is that you can literally go around the whole of the air raid shelters in a wheelchair. It's flat access to every area of the air raid shelters, and you go in straight from the street. Even though you're, as you can see, the cliff behind is building up and building up. Even though you're quite deep, you are on a level entrance, a level playing field as you go in. So that's quite nice. So comes to 1939. What we've got is a local government who have a responsibility under the 1938 Air Raid Precautions Act to provide air raid shelters for their residents. In central Stockport, there's 20,000 residents, about 100,000 in the whole city, or the whole town. They've never really made as a city, but about 20,000 living very, very close together. You can see on this plan, the streets are actually up above, and the houses are shown on that plan. They're very small and very crammed together. And what you've got is a situation where you've got lots and lots of people living together in a very, very small space. Just across Chestergate from there is another set of pretty much slum housing, Victorian terraced housing. It's falling down. It's multiple occupancy. And the area where it says Plaza Theatre, or Plaza Cinema, Super Cinema, sorry, I'll get told off by Ted and Rosie, who run the place, if I don't refer to it correctly. The Super Cinema, that area is called Rock Row, and that was really bad tenements. There were lots of people stuffed in there, living together. And what you would discover is that a lot of these places, you would say, the central government wanted them to have the opportunity to have an air raid shelter, but the options available, which were Morrison and Anderson shelters, the Anderson shelter went outside, you dug down in your garden and you put the soil on top of it. It's not much use to you if you don't have a garden. What you've got is a court, a central location where the toilets are and the bins. And underneath it is cobbles, and there's no way you can put an Anderson shelter. Morrison shelters are a bit too big for the houses that are there, and they were relatively expensive for people who were very low earners. So what you've got a situation is the central the local government started looking at trench shelters in the parks, and they started looking at surface shelters, the pancake shelters as they were known, because they were so flimsy, and if there was a bomb nearby, the concrete lid dropped down and made a pancake of anybody sheltering in them. But to create enough of these for 20,000 people would be almost impossible. So what Stockport Council did, one enterprising gentleman in particular, and his name's actually on this plan, Mr. William Gardner, down there in the right-hand corner, he had a bright idea. And he looked at these holes in the walls at Chestergate, and the holes that we were looking at in the last picture, this one here. So these holes that you can see, these black shapes, correspond to the first 3 entrances on the next plan, where it's got Chestergate entrances there and they're sticking out. And what they did is he had this bright idea that if he dug backwards, he could create a network of tunnels, and he could, they would be safe, and that the people, the residents of Stockport, could get to them quickly from their houses either above or their houses across the road, and they could get into them nice and safely, and they could stay in them for the estimated or expected air raid warning time of about an hour, which is what they were expecting. Around 1938, 1939, they thought the German bombers, they knew they were going to be German bombers, fuel-wise, would only have about an hour over the northwest before having to turn back for home, especially if they were coming up the Irish Sea. So he was looking, and that ladder section at the front, the lower part of the plan, is what he designed first. And he had this bright idea, and he put it forward to local government, and then he put it forward to central government. And of course, central government, who were petrified of deep level shelters and large shelters, immediately said no. No, they don't want this. It's far too many people. One bomb on top of it, and you could lose, 3,000 people. It would be horrific, terrible. There's crushing worries, and of course, this did happen later on in the war at Bethnal Green. There were crush issues, relatively large shelters in Hull and in Liverpool and in Newcastle, and I think there was one in London where the large bombs took out a shelter with a lot of people in, caused hundreds of casualties in one go. And William Gardiner had got around this by having the bright idea that he was going to start digging anyway, and then just basically ask central government to pay for it afterwards. So by the time they'd put it through all the different committees and everything, what had happened was he'd already dug the first ladder section, and it was really nearly ready to open. War was around the corner, and of course they'd made sure that nobody could have these Anderson and Morrison shelters in the town centre, and there was no park nearby that would provide for these people. They looked into using the cellars and basements of large mills, and some of them were converted, but again, they weren't very suitable. The idea was that you didn't have a mill's worth of rubble on top when you were digging down to try and save people. And as you can see from this plan, it's quite carefully designed so that if there was a cave-in, you could dig down either through the churchyard, which is there on the right-hand side, or down through the roadways to get into the shelters. Chestergate had 9 entrances, so it was pretty well served anyway. Here is some lovely health and safety, 1939 style, and these are the navvies from the road gang. When they weren't working on the roads, they were digging the air raid shelters. They were using pneumatic drills. They were working by acetylene light, and they were digging quite happily. There weren't massive amounts of it. I think there were 30 workers, and they tended to work most like evenings and weekends on overtime rates because they were working on the roads during the day. And they dug out the sandstone and dumped it in the river, which was of course just across the way, and they dug away in their usual working flat caps, waistcoats, and open neck shirts, and decent boots. And at the second photo, it's a bit blurry. It's not the best photo we've got, but you can just see they started digging at 2 ends of the shelters at the same time, and digging towards each other. And over the 400 yards of digging, they were an inch out when they broke through. So they were quite pleased with that. They only had to do a little bit of jiggery pokery to get the 2 tunnels to line up. What you've got there is 2 gentlemen digging from one side and 2 gentlemen breaking through from the other. And that's how the shelters were made. They were all made the same way, all 6 of them. Now, this is the shelter accommodation listing that you get from Stockport Council. It was published in the paper, and it was published, and you could apply for a leaflet with this on. And as you can see, what we've got is the tunnels sets. Now, there's 5 listed, and I said there was 6. We'll come back to that in a minute. And the other sites that you can see there are various mills. The Progress Works was a large mill, Bonsalls and Palmer Mills in Portwood. Vernon Mills is still there in Portwood, and there were some the market hall, as you can see, was the one we were talking about earlier. 320 people staying in that tiny little underground space in the centre of the town, centre of the market. But none of them are absolutely massive. Vernon Mills is probably by far the largest at 1,750 people. It's nowhere near even the smallest of the tunnel shelters. And what you've got then is the 5 original sets of shelters, which is Chestergate, which is now the Air Raid Shelters Museum, Stewart Street, and Old Road. In fact, Stewart Street and Maiden Street, the 2,000 and 3,000 seaters, were actually dug out in the 1980s when the ring road was put in. Apparently, when they were dug out, they were full of first aid kits and gas masks and hard hats, and it was all just trashed. It was all just dumped, and stretchers and things like that. And what we've got left is Chestergate, Brinksway, and what's now known as Dodge Hill, which was then called Old Road. So you've got 3 extant shelters available to visit, 2 of which are technically sealed off, although they tend to be opened up about once a month by urbexers and other idiots. But the central one, the main one, is Chestergate, which is around the town centre. It's the largest. It's just over a mile of tunnels. It would hold 4,000 at the beginning of the war. It was actually extended. It would hold 6,500 by the time the extensions were complete. And when it was built, it was a source of great pride for the people of Stockport and for the town council of Stockport. So this is the opening weekend in September 1939. It opened on the 25th, so a couple of 2-3 weeks after war was declared. And as you can see, what you've got there is some very nice tunnels. There's no supports holding up the roof. There's no concrete on this section. It's not needed with sandstone. Sandstone's quite solid. It'll hold itself up. What we've got is some nice sand baggage, and the mayor of Stockport there having cut the ribbon, and the lady mayoress, and it's quite nice because he's got his gas mask on his shoulder. So he's got his top hat and his mayoral chain and his gas mask, and the lady mayoress is there in her fur coat. And this was part of a photo shoot that was done for the Stockport Express. Along with these photos, you can see the original entrance with some lovely signage. We've got some of this signage still available. And you can see the difference between this and those holes in the wall that we saw on that original photograph. It's been quite heavily built up. These are big entrances, and they're solid entrances. They're nice and safe. You want to get 4,000 people underground in a hurry. You don't want them panicking. You want them to have lots of room to be able to get in there and not feel like they're being crushed. The photo on the right is the only photo we have of the shelters with a person actually sheltering. Because as soon as this photo shoot was done, they declared them a state secret and stopped any photos being taken for the rest of the war in case the Germans found out where they were, having had a 3-page spread or 4-page spread in the Stockport Express extolling the virtues of these amazing new shelters. Now, we don't know who the gentleman is, but I quite like to think he's probably Mr. William Gardner. Because if you were the one who designed and pushed through this amazing network of tunnels, you're going to be the one that wants a picture taken in the middle of it. And what you can see is the fact that these are dry, they're lit with electricity, they've got benches, and they've got actual working toilets. They're on mains drainage. So there's a lot of different levels and cross tunnels, and each of them has these benches built into the side of the tunnel, and you've lots of signage there. So the 16-seater toilets that are there that you can visit now were on mains drainage, and they were actually quite luxurious, and that meant that this particular shelter became known as the Chestergate Hotel. Because it had the lights, it had the toilets, the running water, it had a tea room. You could buy tea and coffee. And the other thing that you could do, there was a source of great annoyance to the wardens. You could nip out during the bombing raids and buy tripe and chips from the shop across the road, bring it back, and allegedly the air quality in the tunnels was so good that you could smell vinegar for days afterwards once people had been in with tripe and chips. Some of the wardens allowed smoking, some didn't. They were quite strict about the tunnels and where you could and couldn't go. There wasn't any reserved locations. Remember, at this point, they're still thinking that people are going to come and sit down for an hour and then go back to work, go back home, because the Germans would turn around and go back. So there's different rules for different people as far as we can tell. We've heard different things, of course, a long time ago now. We do have got a few eyewitness reports of being down there, and we have a gentleman that we know was born in the shelters, in the hospital wing there, and he lives in Australia now. And he was born in this section. This is the nurses' station, and it's still there. It's been put back exactly like that now. And what we have is one nurse, who is the gentleman on the left-hand side, who was the nurse from the what was then called the GUM clinic, or the CLAP clinic, and he looked after VD and various diseases that you caught, possibly from going to that cave network we looked at on Brinksway earlier, Maggie's Caves, and he had to be very careful who he said hello to and who he was friendly with when he was in his dual role as a nurse at the hospital within the air raid shelter. The lady on the right-hand side is a nursing auxiliary with the Red Cross and St. John, and the lady in the middle is the photographer's girlfriend dressed up because he needed a third person for the photo. So what you've got is a very luxurious air raid shelter, and especially at the beginning of the war, 1940, 1941, you've got a situation where people actually need to use it. So Stockport was bombed during the war. This is Marsland Street in Portwood, and it was bombed in October 1940. So Stockport was bombed quite a few times, the vast majority of which were 1940 and 1941. Remember I was saying about the Viaduct being a legitimate military target? There were other legitimate military targets there. Sticky bombs, the glue that made sticky bombs was made in Stockport. Ferry Aviation were making ferry battles up on the main road just next to the viaducts, and Woodford was making Lancaster bombers, Manchester bombers, then Lancaster bombers. So it's a legitimate military target, and it was likely to get bombed. And this is what the aftermath of a bombing looks like. So this is high explosive and incendiary, and there were 2 killed in this bombing raid. Now remember me saying there was a question mark of whether there were 5 or 6 shelters. In the beginning of January 1941, the people of Marsden Street and Portwood banded together, and they started a campaign because they didn't have a tunnel air raid shelter within running distance of their homes. They had sandstone, they had caves, they had various things, they had mill basements and cellars, but they didn't have the nice big air raid shelters that the town centre had, and they were a bit cheesed off about it considering they'd been bombed. So there was a plan, and they allegedly dug an extra shelter, a smaller one, only a 1,500 person one, at Marsland Street, which is stable door bolting after the horse, but it's never been found. So the actual tunnel network has never been found. There are various people have been opening manhole covers left, right and centre at the location, now a Tesco's car park, and it's never been found. So it's a possibility that it was built. It's a possibility they reinforced some existing caves. It could have been dug out when the motorway was put in. It could have been dug out when they did some track work on the railways in the 1960s. So, but there is a question mark over whether there are 5 or 6 shelters, as to whether there was an extra shelter put in midway through the war in Portwood. Now, the reason that we don't know whether they did or they didn't is the original shelter plan with that ladder network. Mr. Gardner had the bright idea that he wanted to extend the shelters, and he added extra bits at the back, and he doubled the size of the shelters during 1941 into 1942. So the group that was doing that could easily have dug another shelter and just not bothered to write it down. This extension was an interesting thing, because what had happened was the dastardly Germans, instead of being able to come over for an hour, had basically cheated, and they'd moved their bombing bases, their air bases, about 1,000 miles closer to the UK by not having them in Germany and instead having them in Calais and the other side of the Channel, which meant that they could come over and they could do extended bombing raids over the UK. And that meant they could reach the northwest, and they did. They heavily bombed Manchester, they heavily bombed Liverpool, and Stockport bore the brunt of quite a few of these. So when Manchester was being heavily bombed, Stockport tended to get strays, and but there were some dedicated attacks, and the one that was actually closest to causing problems was this one. Now I'm going to attempt to have a go with the drawing again. So let me see if we get this to work. This is the 23rd of December 1940. So this is as part of the Manchester Blitz. They also targeted Stockport, which is, like I say, it's only 5 miles below Manchester. And this is the aftermath of an aerial mine that's been dropped by parachute. And it's a 12.5-meter wide crater. And to put that in perspective, that's a railway station on the right-hand side, and just above you can see the remains of a rather large truck, which has been blown up and left upside down. And to the side here, you can see some bogies and goods trailers that again have been blown up into the air, and they've been left destroyed. There was quite heavy damage to the mills around this goods station and to the marshalling yards, which were heavily used to transport munitions. So it was very lucky that there wasn't much bigger loss of life. Now, luckily, on this actual raid, on this bomb, there were no casualties at all. Because it was a night blitz and there was nobody in the goods yard, nobody was actually injured, although there were more injuries in Stockport that same night. The other quite nice thing about this image is just over here at the top, you have what has tentatively been identified as a surface air raid shelter, but is much more likely to be your traditional brick outhouse for the workers in the yard there to nip over to if they needed to. Now, this location has been heavily changed over the years and is currently there's a car park and what's called a universal aid store on there that sells wheelchairs and walkers and things like that. I actually went to see them to see if they had any cellars, and they told me they were in the corner of their car park. There's a little hole that every year at particular times of the year the hole expands and there's just a big space underneath. I'm sure they did fill the hole in there. I'm a bit worried that they might have left a 12.5-meter wide crater underneath the universal aid store, which would be a little bit worrying. So as far as Stockport being bombed is concerned, what you've got is a situation where from 1940 1941, you're having extended overnight raids, and people are no longer willing to go and sit on those hard benches for an hour and then go back home. What they're doing is they're coming after work, especially on bombers' moons and when there's good weather, and they are sitting in the area shelters and they are getting tired. So the local government, the council, make the decision that they were going to move on to having bunks, which they had resisted at the beginning of the war because they didn't want people to stay overnight, and to allow people to stay overnight in the air raid shelters. And what that meant was you brought your own bedding, you turned up in granny's fur coat with your insurance papers in your pocket, curled up on the bed, tried to get some sleep in a very noisy, smoky, smelly environment, the smell of tripe and nervous people and toilets, because that extension at the back only has bucket toilets rather than the flush toilets that were available at the front of the shelters. Then, rather helpfully, after mid-1941, there was a lull. The Stockport wasn't actually bombed again until 1944. So Mr. Gardner pushing ahead with his extension to the air raid shelters and claiming all that money back from central government was on a pretty good thing, considering that there were no bombs actually dropped on Stockport. Although, of course, Manchester got bombed, the Greater Manchester got bombed, the Northwest got bombed. There were lots of air raid warnings, but there were no actual bombs dropped on Stockport until 1944. Now, by 1944, very few people were using the shelters. There were maybe 20 people found in there, and it was taking up a lot of time for the air raid wardens. That was unnecessary. So a lot of the civil defence, the air raid precautions were stood down, And the idea was that if there was a confirmed raid, the warden would run over and unlock the gates and let people in. And they officially closed down the shelters on a Sunday evening in 1944. And the very next day, the first V1 landed on Stockport. It was an aerial launch, so it wasn't launched from Europe. It was launched from underneath a bomber, and it did land in Stockport, and it caused far more damage. That one V1 caused far more damage than any of the other bombing raids to the whole of the war. There was 2 dead and 18 injured. 700 homes damaged, 50 of which had to be pulled down from one V1. And to put that in perspective, throughout the whole of the war, the whole 5 years of the war, Stockport had 14 killed and 64 injured in bombing raids. And of those, 2 dead and 18 injured were from this one single V1. Now, of course, an air raid shelter in the way the Stockport's is no use against a V1. You don't know when they're coming, and you don't know where they're going to land, and they're definitely no use against a V2. So the decision was made that the shelters would stay mothballed until the end of the war. Now, we move on a little. So we've come to 1945, the war's over. Stockport suddenly has all these massive underground spaces. What on earth do they do with them? They're still full of bunks. They have working toilets. They have lighting and electricity. And we're in a situation where the council is very, very skint. So what they do is they send 2 apprentices in. The 2 apprentices, one of whom was 14 and one of whom was 16, strip out all the electric lighting. And they pull it all out the way, and they do that by candlelight. We have a recording of them doing it, talking about it in the 80s. And what they leave are these tunnels that are just literally left to rot, and they're still full of bunks. They have sealed off entrances, they have stairways to nowhere, they have gas curtains, and it's all just left there. And every so often somebody pops in to see whether they've collapsed and whether they could be reused. So in the 50s, they looked like they were possibly going to be used for a mushroom farm, but as you can see from this picture on the left, it's far too damp in there to be it was possibly going to be used as a document store. And as you can see from the picture on the left, it's far too damp to be used to put paper in. And it was possibly going to be used as a mushroom farm. And from the picture on the right, you see it's far too sandy to be used as a mushroom farm. And then every so often, as Russian rattled sabers, and in 1963, as and when the Berlin airlift came in, and as and when the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, they would get opened up and somebody would suggest they get made into a bomb shelter. And they were really not suitable for that purpose. They were far too shallow. The deepest point of the Chestergate shelter is 60 feet underground. And a H-bomb or even an atom bomb on Manchester would just devastate that. There wouldn't be any point attempting to convert them. So they were just left. They were broken into regularly by people, the modern equivalent of urbexes, and they would go around with candles and they would write their names on the ceilings and they would spray paint their names on the walls, but they did miss quite a few things. So there on the left is a shovel that was found in the tunnels, and on the right the remains of a banister on one of the sets of stairs. And the next slide shows the stairs quite nicely, and this is actually Dodge Hill air raid shelter, and it shows the concrete line stairs coming down. The white line in the centre is where there was a centre banister put in after the Bethnal Green crush incident, where people lost their lives in Bethnal Green. And originally there was no central banister. There were just the ones either side that you can still see. That the banisters are there on the floor. The lovely patch of light at the top is some idiot who crowbarred their way in through the breeze block entrance. But it did mean we got to go in and take loads of photos before we sealed it all back up again. Now, I was telling you about the bunks that were put in, and they're all still there. They're all concreted into the floor, and they run throughout this mile. Like I say, Chestergate's a mile of tunnels. Brinksway's not much smaller, and even the smaller one at Dodge Hill, the 3,500 people, is full of bunks, and they're just sat there in the dark, not worth pulling out. They're some of them are iron and they've rusted away. Some of them are aluminium and various other things. They're not worth digging out and using, really. And of course, they're all connected together, so you couldn't take one out. You'd have to take the entire run. Now, this is a rather nice gas curtain. There's only 4 of these left in existence in the same locations where they were first put in, and 3 of them are in Stockport. 2 of them in Chestergate, and you can see them on the Flecky Bennett spooky tour, and one in Brinksway, which is sealed off and you can't access it. What this would have been was, of course, they were petrified of gas, especially underneath in the depths, that they would pool down there and kill off hundreds or thousands of people in one go. And there would have been a roll of cloth at the top of these racks, and it would have had a slit in the middle, and you could unroll it down, and it was impregnated with a chemical called dope, which meant that the gas couldn't come through, and they were airlocked out. Interestingly, they're airlocked to an exact specification, which is a World War II stretcher and 2 bearers in between 2 sets of gas curtains. And allegedly there was an armed guard on the inside of the second gas curtain in case there was a rush. They would set up an armed guard there. The Home Guard were based in the shelters to help look after law and order, as were the wardens, and there were police officers and nurses and Red Cross in there as well. So quite a lot of people who were doing voluntary work, doing job work in these. There we go. Here we can see some more of the bunks. The ones on the left are 1940s bunks. These are cast and they're pre-galvanization, so they have rusted and rotted and collapsed. And the ones in the other photo are 1942, and in between they'd invented galvanization, so these are in mint condition. They're identical. You can actually lie on them if you watch Underground Britain, which pops up on a regular basis on 5. You can see the presenter actually lies down on one of these, and they're quite safe to lie on. They're a bit damp and not very comfortable, and the top one is very close to the ceiling. You wouldn't like to wake up with a start. You bang your head. There we go. So as I say, we find quite a lot of things down in the tunnels. So on the left-hand side there's a rather nice bucket, which would have been used as a urinal by the gents. And on the right-hand side is a way out sign. Interestingly, we have a way in sign in a little display in reception. And when I was chatting to the curator who put that in, I said, why don't you put a way out sign next to it? She said, we haven't got any of those. Oh, I know where there is one. And basically it's acclimatized to the temperature and the atmosphere in the tunnels. So if you tried to bring it out now, it would take a huge amount to conserve it, whereas actually leaving it down there, it's quite safe. That black muck that you can see on the wall is almost a type of oil. And it's squeezed out of the sandstone. We claim it's dinosaur bits, but it's much more likely to be trees and things. It's a bugger to get out of your clothes. And I've got a question from Gerald that says, why does sandiness affect use as a mushroom farm? Mushrooms don't like sand. It makes it too dry for them. Also, I've been told. I'm not an expert. There's some of the things deeper into the tunnels. There's a rather nice Elsan bucket toilet there. The electricity was throughout, so the wooden stuff on the right-hand photo is remains of an electrical junction box. And we've got some nice markings on the wall there from the World War II. So we've got some markings from World War II, and then quite a lot of scrape graffiti ever since. And we'll look at some more graffiti in a minute. This is in Dodge Hill Shelters, and this is where people have had candles in the little spaces to one side. You can see where the smoke's gone up and it's affected the sandstone above and marked it where people have had candles. And this is, like I was telling you about the graffiti, and this is quite a nice picture of part of Brinksway. So on the left-hand side there is a pile of bunks that were cut up and destroyed in the 50s and dumped in one of the side tunnels at Brinksway. And what you've got on the concrete sleeve here is layer upon layer of graffiti. The dark stuff is actually candle smoke, And we've got some of that dated to 1949, which is the earliest graffiti we've found. Then it goes on to chalk, it goes on to spray cans and paint, and then it goes on to magic markers, and it goes on to right up to the modern day. So some of these arrows are for finding your way around and finding your way back out, which is always useful. There we go. There's some lovely graffiti. So this is one of the destroyed 16-seaters in Brinksway. And what you would have is a nice big concrete pipe with flowing water underneath your bum. You sat on the hole and used it, and it floated off down to the drains. And allegedly, what you could do if you were a little git, you could make a paper boat and float it down underneath everybody. There were partitions between each of the holes. It wasn't quite as open as this. And if you were a proper little git, you set fire to your boat and caused a methane run, a flame through the pipe, burning everyone's bum. In Brinksway, we have a lot of rubbish that's been dumped there over the years. We actually managed to identify this. This is a bus seat from the 1950s. And we know this partly because of its design and also because part of the material that it was covered with is still in a puddle a bit further up. And it's quite interesting because it's actually next to the fourth existing gas curtain. And so this seat in itself is a museum piece because those buses haven't run in decades. And what you've got is the situation where it's next to the last remaining pieces. Also in there, you've got your traditional, which we find in all underground spaces, if anyone's ever been in them, is the 1980s, 1960s through to 1980s motorway lamps, which are a very useful way to light your way around, especially if they're the paraffin type you can refill. And on the left-hand side there is one of the bulkhead supports for the lamps that were used during the war. So the cabling and the socket and the bulb and the bulkhead itself, the glass has been removed, and it's left behind this, and it shows not only the really well preserved roundel there and the wood that it's connected to, but also the concrete shuttering either side of that is really beautifully done. And you get some very nice concrete shuttering in the tunnels. This is an interesting bit of Brinksway. Now, those caves that we showed you, Maggie's caves where the homeless people lived, and across the road was Brinksway Air Raid Shelter. Basically, the entrances there off the road were very close to the underneath of a mill. And they've only recently demolished this mill, but when we were in there, we discovered that actually there was the clearance between the roof of the shelter entrance and the drainage of the mill was zero. And the mill piping from all their toilets and drainage actually had broken through the air raid shelter entrance way and had sort of been botched together. And this is what you would see there now with a wide variety of roots from trees and cobwebs and things hanging down. Again, this is the hospital unit at Dodge Hill. And what you've got is some nice graffiti. The number 2 is from World War II, and they've got double entrance toilets there. So they are a tunnel network where you go in one side and go out the next, and you go through. The toilets are in there. So that 2 is from World War II. The photograph to one side with Andy, our museum tech there in the middle, has some nice graffiti from 1981 that you can see in front of you. The smoke graffiti is from the 1950s, and it does go right up to almost to the modern day, where you can see there's actually a piece in here where it says, is this where Madeleine McCann disappeared to? And what you've got is modern day graffiti going into that. So there's another photo of the same section, and again, it's a beautiful piece of shuttering, putting this concrete in place, and that's to stop sand dropping down into any wounds or anything that's being treated in the hospital section. And on the right hand side there is an unrestored 16-seater toilet with the chicken wire partition still in place. The little hole at the end is the escape hatch that leads from the ladies to the gents, but not from the gents to the ladies. It's bolted on one side, so you could only escape from the ladies to the gents. You couldn't escape from the gents to the ladies. They're both in the same tunnel. And you can see the bulkhead lighting still in place. That's all original. It's exactly as we found it when we opened it up as a museum in the 1980s, and then in 1996 we lit it, and you can see the bits of bunk and lumps of wood and things are there, and you've got the bunks leading off into the darkness. There's only about 100 feet of the mile of Chestergate that's actually lit. So what you've got is the opportunity to visit just the lit section. You've got the opportunity to go a bit further with an extended tour. You've got the only opportunity to visit the whole of the tunnel network is with Flecky Bennett's ghost tour, spooky tour, which is excellent and combines spooky stories with history, and you get hard hats and go around on that. The tunnels have been used for quite a lot of filming over the years. So the photograph on the left hand side is when Eric and Ernie was filming down there with Victoria Wood, and they filmed at the Plaza Super Cinema, and they filmed in the shelters. The one on the right is Lacey Turner, who I'm reliably informed was in Coronation Street or EastEnders or somewhere, and that's her in Bedlam. And the tunnels were also used as the wife mine for the League of Gentlemen. So if you watch the League of Gentlemen Christmas specials, they were actually filmed in the shelters, and they're very nice. They're quite a large part of their stage show by all accounts. And they've also been filmed for Underground Britain and various little things as well. So got some nice press publicity shots. If you go and visit the shelters, this is what you'll see. They're set up as if it's 1940. So all the equipment that's in there is original, but it's also in really good nick. So we've got a little section there with tea urns, and you can see, you can't get a cup of tea, but you can see where they would have got a cup of tea. The hospital section is there on the left-hand side, and we've got various bits and pieces, tool stores, and places that you can visit. We've also amusingly got an Anderson shelter down one of the side tunnels, so you can see what they're like as well. Even though we didn't use too many of them in the town centre, they were used on the outskirts of Stockport. So the area shelters as a museum has about 40,000 visitors a year. And a lot of those are school children. A couple of schools a day visiting the area shelters, and it's a great boon to Stockport and to the museum service of Stockport to have this unique location. Not only because it was the largest purpose-built civilian shelter in the world when it opened, and that was just Chestergate. There was another 4, possibly 5 of them. They're totally unique, and not only because of their location and their engineering, but also because they were one of the first underground sites to be open to the public. So we opened to do caving tours in the 80s, and then in 96 we opened a central section with hard hats and lamps. In the late 90s we added lights, and throughout in 2014 in 2000 we added a shop. 2014 we revamped the whole of the area shelters end to end, and you can see here we did all new signage. It's all original 1940 signage, but it's on special metal signs that have been put up again into the area shelters, and you can go and visit. You get dressed up and you can go and have a look at the shelters and see an absolutely unique place. What we also managed to do fairly recently is get a proper GIS survey of the shelters. So this, if you compare this to that original map that you had from 1940, there's a couple of little differences, but not too much. And actually, they did a very, very good job. You can see on this one, the yellow part is the section that's lit. The grey part is unlit, and you can see that Mr. Gardner's enthusiasm knew no bounds, and he was thoroughly prepared to continue his ladder network back. And he wanted 20,000-seater air raid shelter here. He wanted 20,000 people to be able to shelter in this one location. As it was, there were about 10,000 bunks, 10,000 spaces across the 5 shelters. And then there were other shelters, like I say, that we looked at that slide at the beginning. I've got a question from Gerald. The shelter slide, how were capacities for public shelters derived? There was a special formula that had to do with how much space that you had. And Joe, you'll be able to look at the slide at the end. What I'll do is I'll put it back to that. I've only got a couple to go, and we're coming up to my time to look at the questions. So if you have the opportunity, there's our beautiful Subbrit website. If you're not a member of Subbrit and you've come today, welcome and thank you for coming. What Subbrit does is we arrange access to places like the air raid shelters. We do behind the scenes tours. We visit across the UK and across across Europe and across the world. And what we do is we arrange access, and if you remember, you can come on tours and visits with us to all different places. We have 2 conferences a year when there isn't a global pandemic, and one's usually in London, and then every second year we have a weekend away. So we've done Nottingham, Belfast, Manchester, Liverpool, and various other locations. And what we do is we try and arrange visits that you can come on, but you don't have to. It's quite in time. Lots of our members are armchair members, and they enjoy visiting through the medium of the photographs that we share on our sites and on our forum that you have access to as a member, and through our magazine. So you have a magazine 3 times a year, which is full color, an absolutely excellent magazine, and it's well worth joining because it costs next to nothing to join. I think it's 27. I'd like to say £27 for the year, and you have access to all this stuff. Tom Wilcox is saying, could the GIS survey picture be shared? Yeah, in higher resolution, that's absolutely no problem. I can get that and put it on the forum. What I can do actually on the forum is share the slideshow of these, and that's no problem. And because these are all either images that have been used through the Creative Commons license from the council, or images that I've actually taken myself. So we had the question about the shelter capacities. Let's have a look. Back in the 20s, go on to Tony. Oh, 24. There it is. So this is the list that the question was about, and it was like, how did they choose these capacities? And it was basically to do, there was a formula you worked out on how many people would fit in by the bit similar to what you get nowadays in a modern office, where you have a certain amount of space as your desk space, and it was worked out that way. A lot of the ones on other sites, especially the trenches, they will be worked out as seated. So these are seated accommodation capacities. They're not lying down capacities. So the bunks haven't been put in there yet. Now, of course, your standard 6-foot bunk would have had seating for 4 people side by side on a bench. But a 3-tier bunk, what you would say is you could have up to 4 babies on the top, side by side, 2 children on the middle, and 1 to 2 adults seated with their feet into the tunnel on the bottom section of the bunk. It would have been very crowded, and I think in all conscience, it's going to be 1 person per bunk, I think, unless they're very small children, and you're not going to get a lot of sleep. They're not. It's very damp down there. Any sort of asthma or anything, you're gonna feel unwell quite quickly, especially if it's the warden who allows smoking. So I don't know if we've got any more questions. We're just coming up to, I've got 15 minutes or 10 minutes before I hand back over to Tony and say thank you very much. Let's have a look at the answered questions. Oh, they're done. There we go. So I haven't got any more questions, but what I will do is put the slideshow up on the Subbrit forum. And like I say, if you come along and Hillary, I've got a question from Hillary. Oxygen levels must have been down and CO2 up to dangerous levels. Excellent question. This will happily see me through my final 10 minutes. As you will see on the pictures, there are no forced air entry air conditioning units in the tunnels. The tunnels do not have any filtering systems or air ingress systems. They use a very, very simple system, and what that is, the center of the tunnels is lower than the edges. So you put people in the middle, They're warm, they're breathing out hot air rises, the hot air goes to the top of the tunnel, and the arch makes it move to the edges. It pushes its way out through the 9 entrances, and fresh, clean air, cooler air is pulled in through the entrances in the centre at the front. And that is exactly how it works now. The air quality in the tunnels is absolutely brilliant. Never had any problems, apart from one point at Brinks Way where it's been sealed up wrongly, and there's one patch that's got some bad air in it. But in Dodge Hill, 90% of Brinks Way and the whole of Chestergate, the air quality is excellent. We do monitor oxygen, CO2, methane as part of our safety checks. And if you do an extended tour, quite often there'll be somebody with a little gas monitor canary, just making sure that there's nothing gone wrong. We've had one activation in 25 years, and it was traced to a group of Cub Scouts who had been having beans on camp, and they were all farting in an enclosed tunnel, and they actually set off the methane monitor. And what we did was we just opened the door and let some fresh air in, and it solved it. So yeah, and that's exactly how they still work. So the air quality in there is absolutely excellent, and it would have been even better if people had actually been in there, because it would have been the flow of air would have been much easier. There we go. Are the other shelters protected in any way? This is from Richard Garner. For example, scheduled monuments. The mill above the Brinksway shelters has just been torn down. Was there some protection for them? None of these are actually protected at all. None of them. They because they're underground, they don't count as historic structures, so they can't be listed grade 1, grade 2, but they could possibly be put down as scheduled ancient monuments. The difficulty being that to get that status is quite difficult, and if we did get it, we'd have to put in, or the shelters would have to put in loads more safety features, and you wouldn't be able to put the signs up on the walls. The emergency exit signs and things would cause a lot more problems. So they're not scheduled at all. So there was no protection at all for the Brinksway shelters when the mill above was torn down. The council has responsibility for making sure people don't get hurt in there. And they do that in a variety of ways. They do that at Chestergate by running it as a museum. They do that at Brinksway and Dodge Hill by making sure that the entrances are sealed up as soon as they're broken open. But they're broken into quite regularly. So there are no protection, Richard. Steve Quinton, what's the condensation build-up? It's horrific. If you go down there with a sheet of paper, within 20 minutes, it's too damp to write on. And those metal boards that have the signage on, it's literally running water coming down them in the condensation. And you do get, if it's very heavy rainfall, 2 days later, it gets very damp in the tunnels. You get the odd puddle where it comes down through the sandstone. So it's very damp. John Smiles, did the government reimburse the council for construction costs without prior approval? They did, but they completely complained about it. It took 2 years of committees and inquiries, and as it was, the local council finally said, look, we're going to go bankrupt unless you pay us back for building these shelters, which we did at your recommendation, and the central government finally said, all right, yes, we will pay you back. But it was, I think it was 1942 before they got the money. So it was very speculative. And the question mark then was, did they use that money to extend the shelters? I think Mr. Gardner had a bit of an empire building bent about him. So we've got just coming up to 10:02. So if we've got any more questions. So as we scoot through, just settle on some more of the photos. These are the stairs, and that's always a popular one. So there's some bunks, and then the green, the black tar coming through. Like I say, you could visit the area shelters and see all these locations at Chestergate. It's open 6 days a week, and I'll just have a look to see if I could spot any. What I'm doing is I'm flicking backwards and forwards through the slides, because I know I went a little bit quickly on the actual underground ones. They're all available on tunnelinspector.com. If you go to tunnelinspector.com, it links to the map that you can click on, and it takes you to each of the folders for the air raid shelters, and you can see each air raid shelter separately and the photographs. For Dodge Hill especially, there's photographs going back to 2012 when we first started sealing them up on a regular basis. And yeah, you could go and visit those. Oxygen levels. Oh, Richard, thank you. The public entry charge, I can't remember, I'm afraid. I stopped working at the shelters last summer, so they may have changed it. So, but it is available. If you go to their website, it's on there, and you can see how much it costs. Like I say, I now do tours of other locations as and when I get my feet in the door. The Mersey and the bridge is amazing. The visit to underneath Mersey is absolutely fantastic. Hi Ian, I can see you've asked this question. It would be a brilliant location for one of your tours, mate. If I could get access under there, it would be absolutely amazing. Underneath there's the actual concrete stanchions that hold up the shopping centre, plus a load of old brickwork from Victorian times. There's some graffiti from French prisoners of war from the Peninsular Wars. There's the base of a chimney from a mill that has been knocked down. Kevin Medcalf, spooky tours are actually done by the gentleman in the question above you, Flecky Bennett. If you send him a question, he'll answer that direct. Simon Wilkinson, on the GIS survey, the corridors running north some have a kink in. The dog leg tunnels, yeah, it's a blast baffle. It was put in during the extensions in 1942, and what it was, the longer tunnels leading to the network at the back all have these dog leg kinks in to stop blast. They also helped with moving the footprint of the tunnels, so if there was a cave in and you were digging down to them, you could dig to different sections. Is there any legitimate access to the large shelters in Manchester yet? No, there isn't. Cathedral Arches is still thoroughly shut, although they do have a newish clerk at the cathedral who we're hoping at some point to try and arrange another visit. Brit visited in 2010 to Cathedral Arches on their Manchester visit. Someone else asked if landowners above had any claim for added insurance costs. No, they don't. If there's a problem, it counts as an act of God, which is what happened in Liverpool when there was the collapse of the tunnel there, and there were 4 or 5 houses affected. It took them a long time to get any sort of payout for the houses, which collapsed into the old overground tunnel, if it makes sense. So yes, so Manchester itself, there's a few locations that we'd like to get back into. They were working quite well until the couple of idiots set a bomb off in Victoria Station and the arena and put back all our access to almost nothing. When I do the write-up for the Victoria Station tunnels, which I think might be in the next but one sub-T magazine, you'll see just how amazing the space is underneath there. Right, we're coming up to 5 minutes, so I'm about to hand back over to Tony to say thank you very much. Sorry about the noise in the background. It's a cat playing with a ball. It's knocking it all the way around the kitchen where I'm sat. So basically, there we are. I'm going to hand back to Tony and say thank you very much to everyone for coming. If you do have any questions, if you want to, and you haven't had a chance to ask them, and I know that the questions don't show up on the recording, so if you're watching the recording and you want to know about the questions, if you send that through to me at tunnelinspector.com or through to me at Subbrit, we'll be able to answer those there. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed your little trip underground in Stockport.
Thanks, Phil. That was a really